Right then, going to be making some molds and pouring some rubber on these soon. If you've never done this sort of thing before, this is just going to be a real basic mold making sort of segment. And for those of you that have done this sort of thing before, don't crucify me. This is just really basic stuff. These aren't production molds. I just need a handful of these, one of these, and another one of these. So these are literally just going to be sort of waste molds more than anything else. Just have a quick look at this wall piece for the saucer section windows. I've filled the windows with CA glue and then sanded it. It's difficult to make it out there. You can still see where the windows used to be, but that's purely because the CA is crazed a little bit, but it is smooth. So that's cool. The deflector dish, I've literally just filled in all of that's outside rim with some green plasticine. Very crude, it doesn't matter. It's better that it's a little bit crude and a little bit oversized. Then when I get the working part out of it, I can sort of retool it and sort of shape it to fit the part that it's going to be going into. So that's fine, that's good enough for my needs. This one's going to be the more complex out of all of the three molds, but even still it's going to be very simple. This is just going to be a cut block mold. We're going to surround it in a wall using this. I'm going to create a box, fill it with rubber, and then when the rubber is cured, we'll turn it upside down, cut that piece of foam core off, this piece, cut that off, and then carefully cut the mold open to get the part back out. There's a little bit of upside down sort of thinking when you make molds like this. You have to think sort of three-dimensionally, but this will make a little bit more sense once we get into that anyway. So this will just have rubber poured straight onto it on the top, and then obviously when you turn the mold over to pour into it, you'll be pouring from the back side. Again, that'll make sense if you've never sort of done this sort of thing before. That'll make sense a bit later. Similarly with this, the rubber would be there'll be a wall built up around this. Then the rubber poured on the top, and then the mold flipped over, the part taken out, and then the resin poured into the top. So that's just a quick brief description of what's going to happen. So I'm going to put some foam core around these and build the walls up and get to estimating the amount of rubber I need to use and start mixing some rubber. So I'll be back in a sec. All right, I've got my mold boxes. Pretty simple deal, just foam core cut to size and stuck all together with loads of hot glue gun. So you can see it's not very pretty, but it'll do the job. When you're doing this sort of thing, for those of you who haven't done this before, you got to make sure that you seal up any kind of gap or any corner that you think the silicone might make its way out, because although it's very thick and viscous, it takes a few hours for it to properly cure and kick off for most silicones, and in that time, if there's anywhere it can get out, it will get out, and you'll find when you come back in the morning that most of your rubbers created a nice puddle around your mold instead of leaving you a nice mold. So as a belt and braces thing, I always go around all of the corners on my mold boxes just to make sure there's no tiny little perforations anywhere or any gaps. Just lay loads of the hot glue in there and you should be good to go. So they're good. They're ready. You can see all these biro lines that I've put in there, all these pen marks. They're just indicators for me when I take this mold box apart. When all the rubber is cured, those lines will be sort of left indicated in the rubber itself, and it'll give me a good idea of where to start the cuts depending on where I start the cut. I haven't really made my mind up whether I'm going to cut it down this direction and open the mold, like a sandwich that way, or whether I'm going to do it down that line and open the sandwich that way. I think it's more likely going to be this way. It's going to be easier, but it's always good to give yourself some options before you get to that point in the task. So this is ready to go. They're all ready to go. This one is just the bottom of a coffee cup. It's already sealed, obviously, out of the factory, so no need to mess around with that. And you notice there's a line on the inside of the cup there. that's an indicator for me of how much rubber I want to put in there without wasting it. You know, you don't want a huge amount of rubber in there because it's just a waste, and rubber is kind of expensive. It's not going to break the bank or anything, but you know, there's no sense in wasting it if there's no need. And the same there's a line going around that box. That's just a visual indicator for me that that's thereabouts where I want my mold to come to. So all that said, the next thing is knowing how much rubber to mix and how much volume I'm going to need to get the molds without too much waste. So with square molds like this and fairly basic shapes, it's pretty simple. You know, you just calculate by measuring the width, height and depth of whatever mold or cavity or void that you're trying to calculate, and do the maths that way. That's okay doing that if you know how much volume you need to compensate for with the part that you're molding. So obviously, if I calculate this with the measurements, I'm also including however much area or volume the part inside is occupying. So when I mix up my silicon, I'll have that much, too much silicon, if that makes sense. With a small part like this, it's not a big deal because I'm going to have wastage anyway, and it's not going to make that much of a difference. But say, for example, if I was molding something that created took up a lot more space in that mold, if I didn't take that up into account, I would have a lot of excess rubber that would be waste, and you want to avoid that, as I said earlier. Another problem with doing that is if you have a quite complex shape, you know, it's not just a square or a rectangle. If you've got odd angles in the mold box because you're trying to cut down on wastage and things like that of excess rubber, it can get very complicated and difficult to calculate the volume that way. And again, with cylinders and like half domes and things like that, it's really difficult to calculate volume accurately when you're trying to take into account what the thing is inside there as well. So the easiest way to do it is to get yourself some uncooked rice. Doesn't matter what it is, and you just use your rice as a proxy for your mold rubber going in. So basically you just pour the rice into your mold box. Sorry if I'm blocking the view, but give it a tap. Something like that. It doesn't have to be exact because, you know, it's not going to be. There's always going to be a little bit of trial and error when you're doing this sort of thing. You're going to waste a little bit, but like that. And pour some in there, something like that. Okay, don't need that now. Just sort of get rid of the excess. There we go, something like that. And get yourself a container that's got the measurements on the side of it. So, you know, obviously this is in milliliters, goes up to 550 mil. So there's not going to be anywhere near that much rubber in there, obviously. And just tip it out, tip the rice out into there. Try not to lose too much of it because it's going to affect how much rubber you're going to end up mixing in the end. There we go. And it's always good when you're doing this to make sure there's no stray rice grains hanging around in there. It's not a problem for a part like this, but for more complex parts or parts that have got more, there you go, there's a good example. See, we've got a little castaway in there, so he needs to come out. Probably not gonna. There we go. So no more rice in there now. None in there. And now I've got a good idea, pretty accurate, of how much rubber I need. So I'm not going to be able to show you properly on the camera, but to me that's just under 150 mil. So 150 mil of rubber is more than enough to get all three of these molds. So RTV Silicon for Dummies 101. Basically it comes in two flavors. You've got condensation or tin cure, or addition or platinum cure silicon rubber. And basically the difference is The platinum cure is slightly higher grade. The molds last a little bit longer. You get very, very little shrinkage with platinum cure silicon. Condensation is cheaper, but you get a little bit more shrinkage. Not too much, probably nothing that you would really notice unless you were molding something huge. And you get less life out of the mold, so like you get less parts poured and cast out of the molds before they start to perish and die. But again, that depends on a lot of factors, a lot of variables. The material that you're casting with, the shape that you're casting, how much flexing the mold needs to make to be able to free the part after it's cured. There are a lot of variables. So, but in general, those are the differences. This is cheaper and it doesn't last quite as long and it shrinks a little bit more. This stuff's more expensive, but it will probably last you longer, and you'll get slightly less shrinkage in your parts, which means more accurate parts. The Polycraft condensation cure stuff and condensation cure silicon in general, I think I might be wrong, but in general they're all mixed at 10-to-1 ratio by weight. And what that means is you've got 10 parts of the uncured silicon to 1 part catalyst, so by weight. So 100 grams of this would need 10 grams of that. With Moldstar 30 in particular, and it's probably a similar story depending on where you're getting your rubber, it's slightly different. You've got the mix ratio is 1-to-1, so it's equal parts A and B, but by volume, not weight. Now that's very, very important that you make sure that you know what your mixing ratio is related to, whether it's the weight or the volume. And getting those two mixed up can be quite an expensive problem. So for an example, if I was to take part A and part B and measure out 100 mil of each and then weigh those, they would not weigh the same. I don't know what they would weigh, but let's just say, for example, 100 mil volume of part A is 90 grams. Part B might be 150 or something, depending on the density of the material. So it's really important that you make sure that you check all your labels and you know exactly what you're mixing, whether it's weight or volume. This stuff is Polycraft's S30. This is their platinum cure silicon, and you can see here their platinum cure is mixed 10-to-1 weight, so it's exactly the same mix ratio as their condensation cure silicon, and it's by weight 10-to-1. So even though these two, the Moldstar 30 and the Polycraft S30, even though they're the same grade, their mixing ratios are completely different. So when you're getting into this for the first time, just double check, reread your documentations and your labels, and just make sure that you know exactly what you're mixing to, because if you get it wrong, it can be an expensive mistake. You probably won't make the mistake again, fair enough, but you want to avoid that in the first place if possible. So all that being said, I don't really have a preference what I'm going to use for these molds, because like I said earlier, they're kind of one and done, almost like a waste mold. So ordinarily I probably wouldn't use the platinum silicon, just because it's, why waste the high grade silicon on a mold that's only going to yield 1 or 2 usable parts that I want and then probably never ever get used again. But these are just what I have left laying around. There's a little bit in the bottom of the container there, so there's probably enough in there to do what I need. So it might end up being this Polycraft, but I'm not sure. It doesn't really make any difference. But when I've made my mind up, we'll set up and start mixing silicon, and we'll go into the ins and outs of pouring molds and getting good molds and bad ones. Okay, so I've decided I'm going to use the Moldstar from Smooth On, the Moldstar 30, purely because the mixing ratio is really dead simple. It's just equal parts A and B, and it's the rubber that I've got the least amount of, and it should be enough to do these molds easily enough. So what I did quickly was I've got some paper cups here because I don't want to waste and still mix up too much. So I've estimated how much I'm going to need, sort of half and half, and drawn a line in Sharpie there. So I'll decant some of each into the containers up to that line, get it mixed up into this pot, give it a good thorough mix up. Going to get the pot then of the mixed silicon into this, which is a vacuum chamber for those that don't know, and we're going to pull a vacuum on that, and what will happen is all of the silicon will rise up and start to look like it's boiling, but that's just where all the gas is escaping and it's drawing out all the air, so we don't get too many bubbles in the rubber. Then we take it out of that, pour it into the moulds nice and carefully, make sure we don't spill it, and then get the moulds then into this pressure pot. It's just like one that I made out of a pressure cooker. The idea in this is when I'm casting my when I'm casting my urethane parts, they're going to be translucent clear, and you don't want to see any bubbles in them. And the only way to avoid that with urethanes is to let them cure under at least 30 psi, which is what I usually do. So there's an indicator on there. We'll get it up to about 30 psi or about 2 bar, and when the resin cures, it will have no bubbles in it, hopefully. So, and it usually works. The reason that I'm pressure curing the rubber in here is because if I didn't do that and there were some small bubbles still left in the silicon mold itself, when I come to pressure cast the resin parts, the pressure will force the resin to push those voids in the molds, and you'll end up with little barbs and little like raised points on your cast part, which is not what you want. So whenever you're pressure casting resin parts, it's always best to pressure cure your rubber molds. That's to say, put it in a pressure pot, get it up to pressure that you'll be casting at, and let it cure at that pressure. So then everything's equalized and you'll get no issues with your molds. So all that being said, I'm going to set this camera up because I need 2 hands for this, and hopefully you'll be able to see what's going on. If I get the opportunity during the process, I'll whip the camera off and do a little bit more handheld and sort of explain what's going on. Right, so I've decanted the A and B, and as it turns out, I've got exactly the right amount to get these moulds. Hopefully they'll be a little bit over. It's better to have a little bit more than you need than not enough. So what I'll do is pour up the small ones first, and then put the rest in this one, and any extra has got room in the top of that mould box. So now the reason that I'm putting it into this larger container instead of just mixing one into the other of these cups is when you vacuum degas any kind of liquid, what happens is it gains volume while all of the gas is expanding and escaping out. And with silicon, it can be, you know, depending on the density and how much air's in it, it can expand quite a lot. Usually at least 3 or 4 times its initial volume. So if I left it in these cups and put it in the vacuum chamber there wouldn't be enough room in the cup to allow it to expand, and it would just all start spilling out everywhere. So it's better to put it in a larger container, not a huge container, because then you're going to have so much waste sitting around on the edge of the pot that you're going to lose, unless you sit there scraping it all out, you're going to lose some of the rubber that you need to go into the mould. So you just sort of have to use your best guess at that. Right, that's the A. Right, now we're on the clock because the A and the B are now starting to combine even before I'm stirring it. So the clock has started. So with this stuff, you've got about 30 or 40 minutes pot life to get everything I need to get done, get the moulds poured and get them into the pressure pot to cure. So that's actually plenty of time for these little moulds. But if you've ganged up a lot of moulds or you're pouring something large, that's something else that you need to consider, is how much time you're going to have to mix the rubber, how much time is it going to take to get it vacuum degassed if that's what you're doing, how long is it going to take to pour it, because you don't just dump it into the moulds, you have to take a bit of time to pour the rubber, make sure you get it in there properly. So all these little considerations have to be taken into account. Okay, so I think I've got everything that I can get out of this. Alright, we just start giving it a good mix. And like I said, you don't want to see any marbling. You need to see a nice consistent colour throughout the silicone. And make sure you scrape everywhere, scrape the bottom, scrape the sides. It's always good to use, this is an old icing, cake icing spatula tool, knife thing. It's thin, it's you know, rigid, so you can really get all of the material moving without it bending in my hand. Now all of this mixing is introducing a lot of air into this rubber, which is not what I want for pressure casting. If I'm not pressure casting, it's not so important, because the pressure, you know, there's no internal pressure going on pushing the resin to try and force voids closed further in the mould and getting weird surface things happen. But also you don't want bubbles sitting on the surface of the part getting trapped down there. Usually if you've got quite a long life rubber, long pot life, the air bubbles will naturally rise up away from the thing that's being moulded anyway, but it's always good to get as much air out as possible. And if you don't have a chamber, you can pour the rubber from quite a height, and with a very thin stream, that helps force any air bubbles out. They pop as they travel down the thin stream. I'll show you that in a few minutes when we come to pouring it. So yeah, a vacuum chamber is not essential, but it makes things a lot better in the long run if you're doing this sort of thing quite a lot, and they're not that expensive. So let's just look, make sure I've got all of the corners. $150 should be more than enough, so give that a second to sort of settle down and check. Don't know, it's more like 100, so it might not be enough, but we'll see what we get. Right, I'm just going to throw this pot now into the vacuum chamber and get the vacuum going, and then I'll take the camera off and show you what's going on the inside of this thing. Okay, so you see the needle starting to rise, but it's actually travelling into negatives. It's going into -1 bar is the maximum that this particular pump can pull. Basically that's just like a compressor, except instead of pushing air out, it's out of the pipe, it's drawing it through. So it's taking all of the air out. If you can see, kind of difficult to see. You can kind of see, it looks like it's boiling. That's all of the air expanding and rising up out of the rubber. And what will happen is it will get to a point and then it will just collapse down in on itself. Up she comes, and the bubbles are getting bigger, and now she's starting to collapse. Yeah, okay, and the gauge is reading -30 psi or 1 bar. Or, sorry, yeah, it's not psi, but anyway, there we go. Once the needles stop moving, it's pretty much all of the tank or all of the pump can draw out. So we'll switch that off, and then we're just going to leave it for a few minutes to let all those bubbles really start to clear up and settle down. And when that's done, I'll take this out and pour the moulds. So yeah, see you in a sec. Right, these bubbles are pretty much done popping. There's still a few, but once I let pressure back into this pot, all of the bubbles will disappear because they're a lot larger in as like a negative vacuum than they would be in normal atmosphere. So I'm just going to vent the chamber slowly. That's air rushing back into this pot now. we go. Now I'm going to carefully pour the rubber using a thin stream. I hope this is going to be in shot, but I'm pouring from a height here and a thin stream. So you can use this technique if you don't have a pressure pot or a vacuum chamber, sorry. And that very thin stream will help pop the bubbles as they're traveling down. It won't eliminate all of them, and even pouring into a mold is going to add air, but nowhere near the amount there would have been if I hadn't vacuum degassed it. So we'll start with this larger mold first because I'm not sure there's enough rubber, so let's get this large one first. Now silicon sticks to silicon, so if I am short, what I could do is mix up another little batch of platinum silicon and just top off the molds that are short once they're cured. You can get away with doing that. Obviously you need to make sure you're using the same kind of silicon, so that you get a good bond and there's no issues. But so again, it's a really thin stream. I'm not pouring onto the part, I'm pouring down into the bottom of the mold and letting the rubber rise up and just sort of encompass and encase the part as it rises, and that way you're not trapping air. Yeah, now looking at it, I don't think it's going to be anywhere near enough, which is a bit of a pain, but never mind. Right, so as you can see, there's nowhere near enough, which is a bit of a pain, but never mind, these things happen. So what I'll do is I'll put this in the pressure pot and let it cure, and then once it's kicked off and cured, I'll top it back up with some more platinum cure silicon. These ones is fine, I'll just mix some more rubber of the condensation cure or something like that and get these going, so I don't lose too much time. This one will have to be done in sort of 2 goes, but never mind. These things happen. I mean, obviously I wouldn't have had this problem if I had plenty of the mold star, but that's it, there's none left now. So I was short, I needed about 150 mil at least, and I only ended up with about 100. So, and plus you lose a little bit in the side of the mixing container there, and plus what I can't get out of those. So never mind, these things happen, so onwards and upwards. Right, all the molds are now in the pressure pot and it's up to pressure. You can see it's 2 bar or 30 psi, something like that. That should be good enough. And I've tied off the handle so I don't try and open it while it's under pressure. Not that I probably couldn't open it under pressure, but you never know. I mean, these things are really dangerous now. It's a pressurized container, so I mean, this pan will take way more pressure than my compressor could ever put in it. It's pretty heavy duty aluminium and it's all locked in when you twist the top together, but still you don't want to take it to chance, so I always put a strap around the handle, not because that's never going to hold the handle shut if this thing was to ever want to get open, but it's more a visual reminder for me not to open it before I've depressurized it. So obviously I couldn't film it because after I'd mixed up the mold star, I was on the clock to get the other rubber mixed, then vacuum degassed and poured into the molds and into this before the mold star started to cure, so I just didn't have time to film it. But not that you're likely to need to see that, it was just a case of putting them in the pot, connecting the hose to the barb and then letting the air in and watching the needle, and then sort of shutting it all off. So pretty basic stuff. Anyway, so I've got to leave this now for quite a few hours for the rubber to really cure, mix up some more platinum silicon so I can top off that other mold and get the molds back out and see if we can start casting some resin parts. Okay then, following day, the rubber is all cured. I've got a good set of molds now. I'll touch on this in a second, but just real quick, I've already demolded these 2. So now you can see how this is going to work. I'm going to pour the resin straight into the back of that mold, and when it cures it will give me an exact copy of this, which is good. And here's the deflector dish, same deal, just pour straight into that. No worries about it trapping air or anything because it's a nice open face mould. It will need to be pressure cast though, like I said earlier, to avoid those bubbles. When you're curing polyurethane, you need to pressure cast it. There's no real way around that. You can see all of the leftover green plasticine. That will come out when I cast the first part. So the first part that comes out of this will be a waste part, but it doesn't matter. Yeah, once that first part is out, it will take all of that dirt with it, and then the next part will be nice and clean, hopefully. It's quite rough and ready around the edge. It doesn't really matter to me. I'll file it and clean it off when I get the part out of it. It's just, you know, I just need a pretty quick waste mold. That's all this is. It's not, you know, I'm not producing these parts because they're not my parts to produce. So I just need to change the color of that and restore it to how it was in, you know, initially when it was bought. So that's what's going to happen with those. So we'll just push those to the side for a sec. And here you can see the block mold that I poured short because I didn't have enough of the mold star, but I topped it off with that Polycraft S30 platinum cure, and you can see it's done it's bonded. It's one piece of rubber, even though they're two different manufacturers, and I poured this at a different time to this. The silicon will bond to silicon, which is why you always have to use a spray release if you're ever doing multi-part molds and pouring up multi-part molds. But anyway, I'll just be cutting this open, and you can see that shining line down there. Those are the lines that have been imparted into the mold from the pen lines that were on the inside of the mold box that I pointed out earlier on in the video. So there they are. You can see them quite clearly, and they're the ones on the bottom. So this is the working face of the mold now. I'll be pouring into this part eventually when it's cut open, and this is the top of the sprue vent that's coming out from the tip of the nose of the grill. If I didn't have that vent there and tried just to pour into one hole down into that cavity, I'm definitely going to trap air, and it's going to be a nightmare trying to get a decent part without bubbles and voids. So if you have that sprue vent, when the liquid goes down into the pour spout, it will drive the air up and out, and then once I've seen resin coming up to this point, I know that I'm good to go and start just leave it to cure. So all that's left to do now is to cut this mold open using these lines as a guide. I'm going to cut it so it opens up this direction like a sandwich. I'm not going to cut it all the way apart into two halves, but I will cut it far enough down that it will spread open enough to get that part out. Right, let's cut this mould apart. There's one thing you got to really bear in mind that's critical to casting good parts when you cut a mould or make a mould, is you've got to get the two rubber halves to key back together again. That's to say, when they press back together, that they're in perfect alignment and they're not offset from each other. And if they are offset, you're going to get a reject part because it's not going to cast properly. You're going to get like misalignment in the mold, and you need to avoid that. So you can cut the mold using a key knife, which is what this is. Hopefully the camera can focus on it. I made this by just heating up a normal blade and bending it, but you can buy these in different sizes. The idea is that you would decide where you're going to put your key and where you're going to split your mold, and just push it down through the rubber, and it would cut that shape and leave a groove in one side and a tongue in the other, which would automatically line back up when the two halves are pressed back together. Now that works really well, and it's a really quick method of doing it, providing you've got enough rubber thickness between the part that you're cutting and the edge of the rubber. I think I can get away with it for the outside cuts, but I can't do that between the pour stub and the vent. There's just no way I can do that. I can't push the knife through because the vent is in the way. So the other way to do it is using a standard blade and cutting a groove into it as you go down. That's a bit more time consuming, but I've got no choice between these 2 points, so I'll be doing both of those techniques. So let's see how we get on with the key knife first. I think there's enough room there, so it's it's literally just a case of deciding where I'm going to start the cut, lining it up with these indicators. I hope you can see this. Now, I'm not getting the tip of the blade right up to the part. I'm leaving a slight gap. Now that's intentional, and I'll come to that in a bit. But basically, I'm just coming a little bit shy, and I'm going to start pushing down like that. I'm just going to keep going, and I'm going to go to pretty much the bottom of the blue region of the rubber for now, and I'll carefully pull the knife back up. So that's our first cut, and you can see how cleanly the rubber is pressed back together. You can barely see that cut, but if I spread it apart, you can see that tongue and groove there. Okay, and I've gone down to just past the blue area into the pink. That's probably not deep enough yet, but well, to get the part out, but it will do for now. So the next thing I'm going to do is carefully spread that and use the normal blade and just finish that cut and try and find that vent and follow the vent all the way down. So that's the next thing. That's where a good set of spreaders comes in handy, or if you haven't got any anything like that, then these circlip pliers do the job nice and comfortably. So you might not be able to see me do this because it's not the sort of thing that's easy to show on camera, but I'm just going to use these to spread the rubber and ease. Maybe if I do it this way. I'm looking for that vent. And once I've found it, I'm just trying to cut a straight line. Apologies if you can't see this, but all I'm doing is running the tip of the knife edge down the vent, down that wire vent. If I was making a set of molds to produce parts like I have done in the past, I'll be taking a lot more care doing this, but you know, because I need it to yield a lot of parts, but I don't need it for this, so it's not so critical. So that's the first cut. You can just see the wire vent in there now. So now I need to repeat that on this face. Now this is where the part is, the actual plastic of the part. So I've got to be careful here that I don't score the part. Although if I did, it's not the end of the world, because obviously I can cast a new one, providing that this mold didn't end up with loads of voids in it. Doesn't feel like it did, but we won't really know until we take the part out. So I'm going to take a bit of care anyway. Take the key knife again, push down, about to the same position where the pink is, and then bring the blade back up and out. It's the sort of thing that if you have a go at it, it's not that difficult really. Just trying to follow a straight line. It can be tricky because you're sort of working in your own way. You're sort of getting in your own way while you're doing this. Okay, so the mould's open there. So now it's just a case of cutting between the vent and the pore and the back of the part. Hopefully you can see this. So I'm going to start here. I'm just going to go and cut like a zigzag like that. I'm going to try and pull the rubber, and I'm just going to try and follow that cut. Right, so we've got fairly good depth now, and now I'm just going to find that vent and just follow it down. And as the mold starts to open, it gets easier. It's going to take a few minutes, but you can see what I'm going for. It's very crude, but it will give us a good part. So I'm going to carry on doing this, and I'll come back when the mold is cut and the part is out. So I'll catch you in a sec. All right, got the mold open. Took a little bit of cutting, but got there in the end. So if I open it up again, that looks like an absolute train wreck. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, this is very crude. Like, I wouldn't have done it this way normally. If this was a production mold, I would have clayed up one half and poured one half of the mold, then turned it over, and then cleaned the part, poured the second part of the mold, and done the whole process properly. But this is a really good, quick and easy way of doing it. Obviously I'm going to have a little, a few more issues seam wise with this, but it doesn't matter because, like I keep saying, I only need one more of these. This part came out fine, no problems, as expected. Wasn't really anticipating to have any problems with it, but so that's good. We can use that part and get one good part out of this mold, and then the mold has done its job. So there we go. Look at the state of that. But the important thing is that when it closes together, you see how clean that sits. Everything's locked and clean and keyed together, so I'll get a good accurate part out of this mold, which is exactly what I wanted. So there we go. That'll do for this episode because it's sort of getting long in the tooth now. I'll move on to casting for the next part because that's pretty straightforward and quick. So we'll get a load of parts cast up and move on with the actual build. So thanks a lot for joining me, and I'll catch you in the next one. So see you later.